the focus of the lecture here is the domestic policy of the progressive presidents. The progressive era 1900 to 1920, 3 progressive presidents. The conservative, not so conservative Republican Theodore Roosevelt. The conservative, not so conservative Republican William Howard Taft. And then the conservative Democrat Woodrow Wilson. These are the presidents of the progressive era. And they each have a domestic policy that is fascinating, interesting, and one way of exploring the progressives. Their foreign policy we'll deal with next week. Their personalities you will deal with in full exploration during your reading of Hofstadter and your roundtable discussion on Friday. But for now, make sure you understand what happens domestically with each of these. Number 1, Theodore Roosevelt, from 1901 to 1908. Republican, vice president becoming president because of assassination. As soon as you say Theodore Roosevelt, what do you say? You say the square deal. The square deal is how to describe his presidency. Each of the 20th century presidents have a moniker, a name, a term applied to them to understand them and what they do. And the first of these, the first of the imperial presidents, the first of the strong presidents, not the bearded, the bland, and the boring, not the ones leaving blots and blanks on the records of the president, the imperial presidents of the 20th century, leading us as people into this incredible American century. The first is Theodore Roosevelt with the square deal. Now the square deal comes from cards, comes from dealing. Had Americans been dealt a fair hand in the prior 40 years of Gilded Age politics, corporate bigness, and social injustice? Absolutely not. Read the Hofstadter, understand him as a personality, and you understand he's fighting for the middle class, he's fighting for the average man, and he believes government can solve the problem and bring that opportunity of America to everyone. We need a square, meaning fair, deal. Okay? That square deal is what he proposes, that square deal is what he implements, and it's a fascinating, fascinating domestic policy. Now, as soon as you say square deal, Theodore Roosevelt Republican square deal, 1901 to 1908, you say it is the 3 C's. 3 aspects, 3 capital C. And the 3 C's are the 3 different aspects of his domestic program, the square deal. Number 1, let's go into those in detail. Control the corporations. And the control of the corporations is potentially what he's most famous for. Know the 4 ways that he does this. And the 4 ways that he does it are very simple. There's a strike. The strike is by the coal miners. The strike is of the anthracite coal companies. Type of coal used by everybody to heat and cook back in the turn of the century. And they strike. And Theodore Roosevelt sits there and says, let's come together to solve the strike. The owners of the mines say, God gave us the right to own these mines. Roosevelt goes berserk. The purloined folly of these mine owners to say that God gave them to right. He almost took them and threw them out of the White House and said, no, negotiate. And he settles the anthracite coal strike by bringing labor and management together and settling the strike. No longer is the government, thank you Grover Cleveland and Pullman strike, going to come in on the side of big business without thinking. Control of corporations. Step number 2, the Hepburn Act and the, I'm forgetting the other name of the act, the Hepburn Act, and there's another act too. Both of these are regulations by the federal government of the railroads. 1903, 1904, he sets up actual regulations stopping kickbacks, rebates, pools, and all of the bad activities of it, gouging the American people, giving teeth to the ICC. The Interstate Commerce Commission can now regulate railroads, can do something with those amalgamations that were horribly damaging the American public. So now we have control of corporations in anthracite coal strike, the Hepburn Act, and I'll remember the other act in a second, is in the textbook. And then number 3, we have a trust. And the trust put together is the Northern Securities Trust. And the Northern Securities Trust is a trust of railroad going across the top of the country. And it's a trust put together. It's a combination in restraint of trade. And what does Theodore Roosevelt do? He busts the trusts. He says, we're not going to allow that railroad to build. And he busts it. And of course they go to court, and he wins the case in court. So the Northern Securities case is the example of a trust being busted by Theodore Roosevelt. Oh my gosh. A president helping labor, a president busting trusts, a president setting up railroad regulations. This is unprecedented. We even have a Department of Corporations within the federal government to monitor business activity to stop them from getting so big. That's amazing. Very interesting. Step number 2, the consumer protection. So you have the 1C, 2Cs, consumer protection. And the consumer protection is brilliant. The jungle, Upton Sinclair, article read, what happens to prior presidents? We have a social ill, they ignore it. What does Theodore Roosevelt do? Invites Upton Sinclair to the White House, brings him in, discusses the problem, and comes up with federal legislation, with the federal government assisting the average person from stopping these corporations producing this awful food that's been put out onto the marketplace. And we have a Pure Food and Drug Act because of that. And we have a Meat Inspection Act because of Theodore Roosevelt. This is amazing. This is consumer protection by the President of the United States, leading us to understand that government can do good for us. And then finally, conservation. And the conservation is fascinating because Theodore Roosevelt wants to conserve our land. He's a